Sorry, wasn't paying attention to the time. We're going to go ahead and get started with tonight's Planning and Zoning Commission special meeting. So let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag and can we do roll call?
Bright? Yes. Freihofer?
Yes.
Howe?
Yes.
Waldron?
Yes. And I would entertain a motion for approval of tonight's agenda.
I motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Everyone in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right. Do we have any public participation? Seeing none, we will move on to the public hearing session of tonight's meeting. The whole reason we're here. A resolution recommending the Cortez City Council the adoption of the proposed comprehensive land use code. Rachel? I'm not sure who's supposed to be presenting. Presenters. So I'd like to go over our process and then an overview of all of the changes in the code. A quick summary of some of the public comments that we have heard through the last 30-day public comment period, and then turn it over to you all for the public hearing portion. So we've had kind of a four-step process through this whole code update. All of our code updates start with a strong foundation, a project kickoff, branding, all the building off of the city's branding colors and logo, so that there was some recognizable imagery throughout the community, throughout the process. We did a series of community listening sessions, and we paired that with the housing action plan. So there were some dual purpose meetings with the housing action plan and the land use code update. We moved into an assessment phase where we looked at the entire existing code and made recommendations for what might be working and what might not be working well, and tied that to the housing action plan. They came out at about the same time so that we could incorporate any of the potential policies from the housing action plan in our assessment. Then we've spent about the last year and a half drafting. So drafting from that assessment report, which kind of set the foundation and roadmap for how we were going to draft the process. And then now here we sit at the adoption phase. We did draft the code in 3 distinct modules. There were a variety of pieces within each module as well. So module 1 addressed just the general provisions chapter, zone district regulations and use standards, because the zone districts and uses are kind of the foundation of any land use code. So we wanted to make sure we got those kind of honed in before we moved on to Module 2, which included subdivision standards, site development standards, and historic preservation. And then into Module 3, which includes the application procedures, floodplain regulations, definitions, and a review of the appendices. So quick overview of kind of the overall changes within the whole code. The current code does have 7 chapters. We've kept the chapter structure fairly similar. The biggest change would be we added a chapter for historic preservation. Historic preservation in your current code sits within Chapter 6 in the application procedures, but there's a lot of very specific historic preservation standards that we felt were better suited in their own chapter. And then that bumped the floodplain regulations to Chapter 8. We are proposing removal of the appendices. All of them are pretty out of date actual applications for development review that the city has replaced over time in a different format. So globally, we took each chapter and kind of reformatted for consistency and to help the flow of the regulations and language. We've added a table of contents to the beginning of each chapter so that when you open up, you know what's in there. We've added tables and graphics throughout to try to help legibility. Whereas there are some new standards in the code, in this proposed code, there are other standards that we pulled back on or kind of opened up for additional flexibility to create balance between the new standards and maybe some expanded existing standards. And those pictures off to the side, oh, I have that little, can you see that? Yeah, are just a couple of snippets from the the proposed code to show some examples. All right, I'm going to walk through each chapter. Some chapters have a little bit more information. Some of them are fairly simple. But I'm going to walk through what changed and kind of what remains the same. So Chapter 1 is the general provisions. What changed is because we are trying to encompass a full code here, we changed the title to the Cortez Land Use Code. We updated the non-conforming provisions, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. We've added additional options in the penalties and violation section to allow for different options for remedying a situation, and they're primarily civil offenses rather than misdemeanor as per the current. The vested property rights are fairly similar. It's just we changed the language slightly so that they're just automatic with approval of a final plan. But what remains, the general purpose of the code remains the same, the general authority and jurisdiction. The jurisdiction is the city of Cortez, not the county, so that remains the same. Relationship to other plans, ordinances, and resolutions, that language remains primarily the same. And then a definition of how to determine a nonconformity, even though the nonconforming section itself saw quite a bit of revision, the definition itself remains the same. So the nonconforming provisions, what we did is we reorganized the language so that it's nonconforming structures, nonconforming uses, and nonconforming signs. So each section has its own kind of subsection to help legibility. We developed a new opt-in process for tracking nonconformities. The current code does have some language that speaks to notifying the city of a nonconformity, but we've developed a certificate, or there will be a certificate that folks can, when they know they have a nonconforming structure, use, or sign, they can come, just fill out a very simple certificate, and that allows the city to track that and say, in the future, if a future application comes in, oh, you're non-conforming, so this is kind of how you would work within this code. We revised the definition of abandoned, so abandoned non-conforming uses or structures currently are 6 months and vacant for 6 months, and we've changed the language to 12 months vacant, just to give a little bit more time. Say someone just needs to get some financing in place to continue the use that gives a little bit more space there. We revised the definition of destruction. Your current language speaks to fire and only natural causes that would cause destruction of a certain building, and then that triggers some additional provisions. We've changed that to just any cause. So if a building is damaged or destructed by any cause, then it would still fall in those provisions. We changed the partial destruction parameters from assessed value to square feet. It's much simpler across the board for everybody to be able to justify square feet versus an assessed value. And then structures, we've added a provision that allows structures to be enlarged, so non-conforming structures to be enlarged as long as they do not exceed the dimensional standards of the zone district. So in Chapter 2, that's the definitions. We did a few changes in this chapter. So we added standards of measurement at the beginning. So there were standards of measurement throughout the existing code in a number of locations, and that's, how to measure a building setback, how to measure building height. We've put that all in one place so it's a little bit easier for folks to use. We've moved all of the land use terms, so when you're speaking to an accessory use or a temporary use or any of the dwelling type uses, any of the uses in the code, we've moved all those definition terms to Chapter 3 to pair up with the use standards in the use table. We removed any outdated terms, added new terms that were applicable to any new language. And then we've removed standards that were embedded in definitions. And the sign code was probably one of the biggest ones the current code has quite a few dimensional standards in the definitions. And we want to leave those in one location rather than having any conflicting provisions. What remains, the general organization of this chapter is very similar. We didn't reorganize a lot of the language. And then the computation of time and general interpretation of terms section remains pretty much the same. One thing I did want to highlight is in the building height, how to measure building height, we added a bit of clarification on accessory projections. So chimneys, steeples, different types of things that might project above the building height. We've added some clarification on those. We did update the definition of family per very recent legislation at the state level, which said we can't define a household by number of folks, basically. We added the historic preservation definitions. There were quite a few definitions in the historic preservation section that were never defined in the current code. With some of the new landscaping and lighting standards, we've brought forward some definitions to help support those sections. And then, as I said before, the sign definitions had quite a few standards embedded in them, so we've cleaned them up to simplify those. Chapter 3 is zone districts and use standards. What changed is we adjusted some of the zone district names to better reflect the intent of those districts, adjusted some dimensional standards to align with Housing Action Plan and just some best practices across the industry. We simplified a fair bit of the design standards, added new housing types, incorporated land use definitions. As I was saying before, the definitions of each of the uses is now in this chapter rather than definitions. And then what remains, the intent, number, and location of all the zone districts. So we haven't changed any zone district boundaries or the intent of any of those zone districts. We have added purpose statements in each of the zone districts to try to help clarify their intent, but did not change that intent. Many of the parameters of the R1 zone district were preserved, just to preserve the intent of that district being as it is. And then we maintained and expanded upon many of the existing land uses. So a lot of the existing land uses do remain. A few of them were out of date, so we've changed either the terminology or removed them and added to the land uses anywhere where we needed to. Oops. So within the zone districts, I mentioned a moment ago that we changed a few of the names. So we have proposed to change the manufactured home district to mixed residential and change it to R3 instead of MH. And the purpose of that is that district is comprised of not just manufactured homes. There's many single-family homes, duplexes, small lot, large lot. So it's really, in the city, it's probably the most diverse residential zone district. And so mixed residential kind of felt appropriate based on a lot of our conversations because it's a real mix of different residential uses. We changed highway commercial to general commercial. And again, the purpose of that is not all of the property that's zoned highway commercial is actually along the highway. So some of the highway commercial is just generally commercial in the general vicinity of the highway. We also have proposed to change the residential estate zone district to a legacy district. There's only 2 or maybe 3 properties zoned residential estate. They can continue to operate under as they are, but a legacy district means that no new properties would be zoned residential estate. We simplified the PUD regulations. The current code writes the PUD regulations as like an overlay, which would be an overlay to one of these other districts, but the intent was really to have it be its own zone district that's rezoned to PUD for kind of unique type of development. So we've retooled that chapter a bit to follow that intent. We reduced the minimum lot size from 7,000 square feet to 6,000 in the R1 zone. And this has a pretty big impact on non-conforming lots in a good way. A lot of the existing lots in the R1 zone are already around 6,000 square feet or 6,500, and which leaves them as non-conforming lots. By reducing that lot size now, they're now conforming lots. So I think it makes it a little simpler for them to do any future infill development or remodeling or anything with their homes. And then we've reduced in the R2 and R3 the minimum lot size from 6,000 to 4,000. Again, that one is to accommodate a lot of the recommendations. We've reduced the residential front setbacks from 20 feet to 15 feet to allow a little bit more flexibility, except garages. They still need to be at 20 feet to allow for parking a car in the driveway. And then we've increased the maximum lot coverage across the board. Again, what this really will allow is, since we've reduced those lot sizes, increasing the lot coverage now, you can still have the same size house on that parcel without being impacted. Within the use regulations, the main thing I wanted to highlight is that we did expand a lot of the housing options in the R2 and R3 zone districts, just to make sure that there is a lot more variety allowed in those districts. And we've added a number of new uses, and among those are cottage cluster, micro home, tiny home, modular home, and then we've clarified what a multifamily housing is. I think it was a different term currently, and we renamed apartment to mixed use. In Chapter 4, the subdivision standards, we've added the subdivision classifications, so what the difference between a minor and a major subdivision. Updated the street standards, simplified the public land dedications quite a bit. They're very, in your current code, they're quite complex, let's just say. We combined all the improvement standards into a subsection, added development improvement agreement section to really spell out what would be entailed within a development improvement agreement. We added improvement guarantee language, and then the impact fee section was very nuanced, and so we've simplified that quite a bit to try to address the intent of that section. And then what remains, the scope and applicability of this section is primarily the same. The easement standards are mostly the same with some very minor clarifications and modifications. Generally the required improvements, so putting in streets and utilities and all of that is still in here. As I said, we've combined some of that language into a section altogether. And the land dedication amount is still 5%. So that public land dedication section that we've reworked, the total land dedication is still 5%. And just to highlight what we did with the street standards, we incorporated private street standards from the PUD section, updated terminology and dimensions to match the master street plan. We added median design standards, just a couple little provisions to help guide median designs. And then optional bike lane design criteria. So we've included bike lane design criteria, but it's just at the discretion of the developer. It's not a requirement. So just some standards to guide that if they are added. Chapter 5, the site development standards. This is always in land use codes one of the biggest sections. It just has a lot of information. So we've reduced the off-street parking requirements in a number of uses, added an alternative and shared parking standards to provide a little flexibility from parking. It's really hard sometimes to really assess what is the actual need of a use. So you have those standards, but then there's an alternative plan that can be presented. We increased the sidewalk width from 4 feet to 5 feet and added some language about where there are existing sidewalks. You can continue the existing width. You don't have to have a patchwork of a 3-foot sidewalk to 5 foot to 3 foot. We've updated the landscape standards, added lighting standards, added some new natural resource protection standards. In the signs, we've added electronic signs and updated the billboard regulations. What remains is the basic concept and computation of parking requirements. A majority of the fencing standards remain the same. We've kind of reorganized some of the language for clarity in that section. The landscape plan requirements, what you submit with a landscape plan, remains primarily the same, and then a majority of the sign standards remain untouched. So with the landscape standards, the current code requires just 10% of a parcel to be landscaped, and not a whole lot of other specificity. What we've done is we've created kind of a tiered system of tailored standards by use and location. So there are specific standards for commercial and multifamily uses versus industrial, and the commercial and multifamily uses are a little bit more landscaping than you would see at an industrial site. Single-family residential are exempt from those specific standards. We added parking lot-specific landscape standards and some prohibited plant material list, speaking to invasive species. That piece is actually tied to some recent legislation at the state level as well. And this is where a lot of our new graphics come in to help kind of explain these landscape standards. We've added lighting standards. Your current code does not have any lighting standards, and we tried to strike a balance between going fully dark sky and no standards at all. So tried to find some kind of happy medium in the middle with fully downward directed and shielded lights, a color rating maximum, a light level maximum, and then just language that prohibits flashing, blinking lights, and obtrusive lighting. The natural resource standards, fairly simple, just added some buffer standards from waterways. As we were doing our analysis within the city, there's not a ton of, waterways that this would apply to, but there are a couple. We also added some wetland standards. There have been some changes at the federal level in recent years of what falls under the federal designation of the Army Corps of Engineers for wetlands and what needs to be monitored at the local or state level. So we've kind of built in kind of a baseline section on wetlands for the city to build on as legislation may change. But it clarifies the difference between a federally designated wetland and an artificial wetland as well. In the sign standards, we've added a few graphics clarifying what requires a permit and what does not. We reduced the maximum wall sign area from 200 square feet to 128 square feet to be consistent with some of the other dimensions in the code. We added some window sign standards, electronic message sign standards, a provision to prohibit new billboards based on some conversations with Planning Commission and City Council. And then added optional, that was the last slide, the bike lane standards. In Chapter 6, this is the administration and procedures. We've reorganized that whole chapter into 4 distinct sections. So you have the review and decision-making authorities all in one section, common review procedures, and specific review procedures. We added a procedure table, which I'll show you guys in a second. It identifies each application type and who is the review and decision-making authority of each application. We've combined all the public noticing procedures into one section rather than having them peppered throughout each application type. We separated the rezone and text amendments. They were combined as one in your current code and really are two separate procedures. We clarified the site plan process and then updated some of the decision-making authority for preliminary plats to a administrative process. What remains is the overall intent of the chapter. This was always intended to spell out the procedures of different application types. The overall list of development applications remains. We built off of the existing list and added a few for clarification. And then most of the procedures and review and decision-making authorities remain the same with the minor tweaks that I've spelled out. And here's an example of what that review procedure summary table looks like. So you can see there's a reference section which references where those standards are, whether a pre-application conference is required, what authority the zoning administrator versus Historic Preservation Board, Planning Commission, and City Council have. This is a very useful tool at all levels. It really helps the applicant come in and say, I know what to do with my application. It helps staff, kind of guide the process. And then it also helps you all to say, oh, we are recommending a body or a decision-making body. So the other big change in the administration and procedures chapter is the site plan process. There's currently, I think, about a 3-step process of administrative. There's certain applications that come to Planning Commission, and then there's certain applications that go to City Council. So we've kind of changed that into 2, where you have a minor site plan and a major site plan. Minor is administratively approved, and major goes through Planning Commission and City Council. And a minor site plan can be a single-family lot, a duplex lot, development less than a quarter acre, creation of addition of 3 or less multifamily units, change to existing property that results in less than 25% change to an existing property that does not result in additional traffic, noise, or smell. Change does not result in more than 100 additional average daily trips on adjacent roads. Change that does not result in a change in traffic patterns on adjacent roads, and change to an existing mobile home park where no uses and density is not increased. No new uses are added and density is not increased. All right, we're almost done. Chapter 7, Historic Preservation. A lot of the language remains the same in this chapter, the overall intent of the regulations and much of the review criteria. A lot of that comes down from the state level, the State Historic Preservation Office. And even from the national parks. Like I said, we did pull this out of Chapter 6, so it's its own chapter now. We added a new applicability section to differentiate between local, state, and national register. And then we've clarified the demolition procedures. Chapter 8 really comes straight down from FEMA and the state, and so we did some formatting and terminology to match the other chapters. Other than that, the intent of the chapter and the majority of the language is the same. And then I mentioned the appendices earlier, that all of the outdated development applications and subdivision improvement agreement template will be removed. All right, so that gets us through all the changes. And I just wanted to highlight just a handful of comments we heard. We did post the full code on Conveo for public review over the last 30 days. Didn't get very many comments on Conveo, but we did get a few comments through a Google form that we had on the website as well. So one of the questions or comments was a concern about a lack of a noise ordinance in the city, and realizing that the municipal code itself does not have a noise ordinance. We had already added in section 5.11 or 5.011 reference to the state requirements for noise. And this is just a little screenshot out of the state regulations where there's certain decibel ratings for different types of zone districts at certain times of the day. So it does give the city something to hang their hat on for enforcement of noise. There were about 3 comments about recognition of the strong work that was put into the updated code, really getting to some layman's terms that make the code more legible. And I had a comment saying that the increased density in the neighborhood business zone district was much appreciated. So we say thank you to those comments. There was a question about regulating types of fertilizers to be used or sold in the city. And that really isn't something that the land use code has jurisdiction over, but the municipal code could. So thought we would highlight that as something that the city may, want to think about down the road. In the subdivision section, we did have one comment, the concern over long-term effects of subdivisions on the overall health of the area. Based on the comment, I believe they might have been talking about some of the subdivisions more in the county, but just looking at subdivisions collectively, it is definitely something to think about. And it is something that's guided by the comprehensive plan. The code really speaks to the standards. Once you have identified an area for growth or development, then this land use code identifies those standards. But the comprehensive plan is where you really define, how much growth we want in any particular area. Excuse me. There were 2 questions or concerns about section 1.04.4 that states the relationship to other plans. And there is a provision in there, and it's in your current code, that speaks to subdivisions that come in the county come through the city as a referral agency. And that is just common practice. The city does not have any jurisdiction over those and does not make any decision on those. They just come in for a review because they're in that 3-mile coordinated planning area. So, and then there was a question about section 1.05.2.b in the non-conforming regulations, asking if businesses would be notified if they are non-conforming, and the answer is no. It's just a process to certify that it's a voluntary process like we've talked about. So if they were to come in with any kind of application, then they would, if they didn't know that they had a non-conforming use or building or structure, then they would work through that process with the city. And the last comment was, there was a question about setbacks off of alleys. We don't have any specific differentiation in our rear setbacks in the dimensional standards. And so there was a question about should we add setbacks for alleys that might be a little bit different. I think our rear setback currently proposed is at 7 feet, but thinking about, for example, maybe a residential property and you're putting a shed at the back of your property, does it really need to be 7 feet from the back property line? And my suggestion is we could reduce that to 3 feet for accessory structures. I think you'd still want to keep principal structures to at least 5 feet. So just something to consider based on one comment that came in. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions for us on any of that?
I do. We've had this open and transparent process that's been going on for some time. The public was always invited to whatever meeting there was on the land use plan, and we just described the comments that have been received. And personally, I've really appreciated that process of openness and transparency and giving the public a chance to always take a look at what's going on and comment, and you just talked about some of the public comments. We received a memo tonight from the city attorney, which has not gone through any review. We received it literally minutes before the meeting. And I guess unless there's some fire that I don't know about on this process and these recommendations. I'm wondering why we're seeing it at this late date.
Yeah, I can probably speak to that. So in looking through all of the new code provisions and making edits, there were a couple of issues that came up that had not been fully vetted, in my opinion, and I think some other staff members. One was a very basic one. When should this land use, the new code, be applicable? And in Colorado, there's a statute that mandates that the code, that a new code cannot be applicable to any applications that have been submitted prior to the adoption of the new code. And so our thought was, number one, we need to define what is a submittal of an application. We didn't want it to be somebody sketching in a request for a subdivision on a cocktail napkin and handing it to the planning staff and say, hey, I submitted it before you adopted the new code. This is obviously a short-term issue because at some point the new code will be fully adopted, and any applications submitted after that date will have to come under the regulation that have been adopted that you're reviewing tonight. But we wanted to be clear that since the state statute uses the specific term submitted, that we define submitted as only occurring when we receive a completed application and all the fees have been paid for that application. And we define what a completed application is, and the idea being that the clock doesn't start ticking until the applicant actually fills out the application, submits it with all the required information that's in the code. And at that point, we determine that the application has been submitted. And if the new code effective date has occurred already, then that application goes under the new regulations. If the application is submitted, as we've defined it here, prior to the effective date of the new code, then they are reviewed under the existing code, not the new code. Now, there's a couple other issues, or at least one other issue that we wanted to determine is when should the effective date of this new code be? And as you know, the process goes, first, Planning Commission hears it, which you're doing tonight, and assuming you complete your review tonight, you certainly have the ability to vote to continue this hearing to a date certain if you determine that you need additional information or additional time to review everything. But at the time you make your submittal or your recommendation to the City Council, then it goes as an ordinance to the City Council, and they have a first reading, and then 2 weeks later is the second reading. And the second reading is when the public hearing is for council to consider adopting the code. And they also have the right to determine that they want to continue the public hearing to a later date if if the room fills up with public and not everybody's had a chance to speak, or they raise issues that we have to look at and reconsider any drafting points, then they can continue that to as many multiple hearings as they think are necessary. But generally, most ordinances are introduced on first reading and then placed on a public hearing schedule 2 weeks later, and they're either adopted or the council votes not to adopt the ordinance at that time. Then the process turns to a publication. If the ordinance is actually adopted, then it's published in the newspaper an additional time after the vote to adopt it. And the thought, I think, amongst staff was that perhaps 30 days after that publication would be an appropriate time to make the ordinance and the land use code effective. And if you guys think that's, am I correctly summarizing what we discussed? But,
Well, I guess
oh,
the situation the planning commission is in is that we're asked to make a recommendation with no public review, and I'm
well, and tonight is public review. It's
I
streamed.
mean, it hasn't been advertised.
But
Yeah.
I think that what my colleague is asking, right, is like, this is 3 pages of
Yes,
suggested
no,
amendments.
you're correct.
And there's a
that
couple
we
items.
only the folks in this room and maybe a few other people at City Hall have seen.
A couple items on here seem substantive to me.
Yeah. Now, if you'll recall, one of the options, when you hear this, it's not either up or down on what was submitted in the packet. And this occurs in other instances, not just resolutions, but if you're reviewing site plans and that sort of thing, you come up with changes, sometimes substantive changes, on the fly the night of the hearing. Sometimes they haven't even been suggested or reviewed by staff. It comes about as part of the public comment period, or the applicants make suggestions from the podium. So it's not, certainly not illegal, but if you're hesitant to make recommendations, items that have not been published in an agenda, then
And this whole process has been so open and transparent, I just don't want to add something like this
Sure.
to it personally. That's speaking for me.
Okay. And the other, I'll just explain the other, in addition to the timing of the effective date, that there are actually 2 other issues that I've addressed in the memo. One is there was a provision in the existing code that transferred over to this code that said that an applicant cannot begin the review process of their application if they owe the city money in any form or fashion. So if their business owes sales tax, or they have unpaid parking tickets, or whatever the issue may be, if they owe the city money, the language in the proposed code says we won't review your application. And from a practical standpoint, I think the consensus amongst staff was it's difficult to determine all of those because the planning, economic development, community development department, they don't deal with sales tax or property tax or a lot of other fines and fees that an applicant may owe. And certainly it wouldn't be impossible to figure that out, but it would take some staff resources that they were not comfortable committing towards that goal. And so the thought was maybe limit it to the fees that are applicable to the pending application that they're considering. And if the applicant hasn't paid those fees, their application is not deemed to be complete, and it won't go forward until they actually pay the fees. That was, and, you know, if the other staff wants to comment on that, you know, they said,
I have a question on that.
okay.
We don't get a ton of applications. So when you talk about use of staff time to track that down, it's already pretty small because we don't get a lot of applications. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I kind of like the original one where it is anything that you owe to the city. You have to be in good financial standing with the city, big umbrella, you have to fit under it. So it seems like we're kind of cutting ourselves off at the knees in an effort to simplify what is essentially someone's job to review. And so I don't know, I guess I'm struggling with that recommended amendment to see how that benefits the citizens of Cortez if we're not willing to do our homework at the staff level and determine if people are in good financial standing with the city.
Well, and I'll certainly let Rachel comment, but this does not eliminate the city's ability to collect these other fees and taxes and whatever other monies are owed. It simply does not tie them to a land use application process. And so that we still have that availability, and when the department that is owed the fee, other than the land use fee, determines that they've got somebody that owes them money, they still have the opportunity, usually through my office eventually, to collect those fees. And so it's not, we're not eliminating the city's ability to collect fees. We're just, the recommendation, I think, was to not tie it to a particular land use application. And
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I'm still wondering, how does that benefit the citizens of Cortez over a singular applicant? It seems as though that amendment is really in favor of an applicant who might not be in good financial standing. So I guess my question remains, what is the benefit to the citizens? And it's okay if you don't have an answer. It can be a rhetorical
I think it's a really good point. It's not I don't see it as a benefit. We honestly couldn't come up with what they might owe I mean, because you pay taxes to the county, right? The county assessor. So we're like, well, could it be sales tax, or maybe a fine from a violation? That's the only thing we could think of when we noticed that in there. And we're honestly, nobody's here, but don't check now to see if an applicant owes something somewhere in the city. So I think Pat's recommendation was, let's not have things in there that we don't enforce, or we might not enforce clearly. Let's make sure we can enforce everything that's in the code. So that it's not a big deal. I think we could leave it in there if you want, but it also isn't really, I don't know if it's very effective or enforceable now. I mean, I guess it's enforceable. It's hard to figure out. And then the other issue was it says applicant. Usually there's a landowner, there's an applicant, and which one, and if it's the landowner that owes money and the person is trying to rent from them, are we going to punish the person that's trying to rent from them, or vice versa? So that's why we just, actually today, we were like, why is that there? And maybe it should come out. So
Could I
not
ask,
a big deal.
could I ask a hypothetical question? So if we, as a commission, were to approve just the original resolution as presented by staff, then that recommendation would go to council, but also city attorney's memorandum would go to city council for possible action.
Yes, I think that the staff always reserves the right to make recommendations that are either consistent with the planning commission's recommendation, or that are in addition to or contrary to. I mean, I haven't really seen it here, but periodically the staff will recommend denial of an application. Planning commission will recommend approval, and so the staff, both recommendations go forward to the city council. So certainly
Yeah, as you pointed out, though, by the time it got to council, it would have had, the public would have had a chance to take a look at it.
Sure.
And-
That's absolutely correct.
Sorry, were you done? I also, I guess, wanted a little bit of clarity because some of the memo that we've received has really clear, like, red line strikeout. And some of the language says some possible language could be inserted, and then there's an example. Or another one says, my proposed language would be something similar to the following. And so I guess I'm wondering, what was is the intent of this memo that we, in making a motion of recommendation, include these suggestions in that motion? Or is the intent of this memo just to say, hey, we're going to send this memo to council with the ordinance?
Yes, so the
With the recommendation?
language that is in red font is not, it's not track changes, it's new language that I'm proposing be added to a particular section. I didn't want to have to type the whole section
Sure.
and then add it on, but it's new language. There are a couple sections in here that show strikeouts of particular words or phrases and then the additional language. But for the most
So-
part, the red language, red font language is new language. I hesitate to use track changes too much because it gets confusing when we're looking at multi-page codes. But
So I guess that's my confusion is your proposed language the red text, or is your proposed language something similar to the red text, which
Well-
is in front of us? I mean, I think like we have to take it seriously. We're considering changes that the public hasn't seen, and I don't feel like the language from staff is super clear. Like, are we proposing this, or are we proposing an unknown similar thing?
the language I'm suggesting is the red font language. If Planning Commission wanted to, or in the case in a couple weeks, the City Council wanted to make changes to the language I suggested, that's why I said similar to this, because certainly there are different ways you can say things, and after the discussion tonight or the discussion at the public hearing in front of City Council, if there is some modifications to the language I'm proposing, I wanted to be clear that what I'm proposing is not mandatory, that if you don't adopt it, you're doing something illegal. It's certainly my suggestion that it be adopted, but if the, you know, and this staff may have alternate language they want to suggest at some point. Probably, I don't know about tonight necessarily, but if this goes forward to the City Council, then it can, you know, I can remove the substantially similar language and just say, here's what I propose. And if they don't like it, they can edit it, as can you, to make it say what you want it to say, because everything that I put down or that the rest of the staff puts down is merely a suggested recommendation.
Okay. Additional questions for staff? And so now we are good to deliberate amongst ourselves, correct?
I would open it up to the public in case somebody is listening outside, wants to come in to,
Okay.
and then recognize if nobody offers public input, that you close the public comment portion of the hearing.
Any public comment? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public comment section and move on to commission deliberations. Does anyone want to kick it off with thoughts?
Well, I think the commission's probably aware of my feelings now. I would be in favor of the original motion as suggested by staff, but, and I would make that motion after discussion. But
So your preference would be for council, or I mean, for commission to not necessarily make any suggestions based on the memo we received tonight, but rather to leave those decisions up to council.
That's correct. After the public has had a chance to take a look at it, and then the council will have the opportunity to hear that informed opinion from the public.
I do agree with that. I just believe that like these additional edits at last minute are very crucial, especially, I had notes here too for the fees. I do understand that we might not have the manpower to, determine who has fees all across the county or the city. However, if we were to have somebody who is delinquent or very delinquent in taxes to the county, we should, like you said, we should do the right thing and follow up with that. Especially if one do have multiple properties and neglects one, then that should be investigated and determined. With this, removing any of these wording would open opportunities for somebody to take advantage of it, of owing to the city or the county and continue to neglect one property, but upgrade or increase the benefit of another property. So I would agree to remain, to move forward with no.
I think your comments are appropriate myself.
Any other thoughts? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion.
I make a motion that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend that council repeal in its entirety City of Cortez Land Use Code and adopt an updated City of Cortez Land Use Code containing Nina's suggestions. I'm not sure how we want to word that. Perhaps the clerk can help us with that.
You're in reference to the memo? Or,
Her comments.
I'm not sure what kind of help you.
Madam Chair, before you take a second, just to clarify, the motion properly should contain a motion to approve the resolution, what's the number?
Okay.
Resolution number 3.
Number 3, Series 2025.
Yeah. And.
I make that change to my motion.
And I guess to further clarify, you all have made some comments relative to the suggested additions that are in my memo, but as I understand, the preference of the commission is to not adopt those comments. The city council receives the minutes of this meeting, which will contain the comments that you've all made relative to the suggested changes. But as I understand your motion, you only want to approve the resolution without any amendments that approves the land use code as submitted in your packet. Is that
That's my motion,
okay?
Does everyone understand Bob's motion?
including me.
Is there a second?
I second.
Any additional discussion? Let's take a vote.
Tao,
Yes.
Fryhofer,
Yes.
Bright,
Yes.
Waldron.
Yes. Cool, motion passes. I want to say thank you to Jen and Logan Simpson. I know a lot of times people think that the code is really boring until it tells them that they can't do something that they want to do. And I am really appreciative of you guys knowing your stuff and helping us to get to a place where it's a little more understandable. I definitely learned a lot in the process, so thank you. Thank you for your time and expertise.
It was a great process.
And with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.